Gerald poked the notes in his pocket, then dived into a pouch on the front of his overalls for Drew's change. "Here you are." He dropped a few grubby coins back into his hand. "Thanks, Drew," he said simply, and took a step back for them to pull away. "Thanks, Gerald. See you," Drew called, and pulled out. "A man of few words," the inspector commented, as Gerald headed back to his garage. "Yes, you can never get much out of Gerald," Drew agreed. He put them back on course, and as they travelled, the inspector continued to study his device and their route on the map. As they made their way out of the trees and Firestone disappeared behind them, the needle on the device slowly sank, and the green light dwindled away to nothing. The inspector marked the location on the map where the needle reached a normal level, and continued to watch it in case it began to move again. After a few miles, he realised he was going to be disappointed. He turned back to the map contemplatively. Drew noticed he was deep in thought, so remained silent, allowing him to concentrate. The road between the two towns afforded wide views of the barren moors. They were eerily misty and empty of any life other than the thick heather which sprouted low to the ground. The rolling hills spilt out around them, a patchwork of earthy greens and reds. They reached the summit of a low tor, and from its wide peak Nettlewood came into sight a short distance away. The first two X's were only accessible by driving to the far side of Nettlewood, down a thin road that led away from the town and onto a busy road going east-west. The drive was long, and the inspector continued studying his device to see if it detected anything. It barely stirred. They brushed past the town of Nettlewood, the view opening up to a mishmash of farmland lying fallow during winter. Beyond these fields, hills stretched, greens and browns mingled, the fertile countryside surrounded them magnificently. Although the road was busy, by comparison to the main road that connected Firestone and Nettlewood, it was quiet this afternoon. As the part of the road where the inspector had drawn his X approached, Drew carefully slowed his car down, putting his hazards and blue lights on as a precaution. "It should be along here somewhere, I think." Drew glanced down at the map on the inspector's lap to try and gauge their position. "Yes, you're doing fine, Drew. Just up here somewhere." The inspector didn't look at his map or the road, but instead kept a close eye on his device, looking for any indication of change. It soon became obvious that they must have passed the spot in question, and the contraption had made no sign of detecting anything. Drew pulled up at the side of the road. "I think we missed it. Would you like me to turn around, circle back and see if we can see anything?" he asked. "No, thank you. If there had been anything to see, I'm sure we would have seen it. Perhaps we should press on." Drew nodded, checked his mirrors, and pulled out onto the empty road. Once safely on their way, he flicked off the hazards and the blue lights. The road they were on was bordered by a lone stone wall on the side, which stretched along the road for many miles and must have been some feat to construct. The other side of the road was fenced with a rickety wood fence, and beyond this the moors ruled the land with their barren mystery. The road swept gradually south for a few miles. As it traced the border of a farm, the road gradually curved round to the east, and Drew guided them along the quiet roads until he eventually took a sharp turn left onto a road that carried them northwards again back towards Nettlewood. They were soon approaching the next X that the inspector had marked on his map, and again Drew slowed the car, turning the hazards and blue lights on to alert fellow road users to his presence. He studied the side of the road, trying to see anything that might have caused the inspector to want him to drive this way. The area they were looking for was sown past with the same result. Drew stopped again, still slightly confused as to what it was they were searching for. "Still nothing?" he asked. "No," the inspector replied, not sounding either surprised or disappointed. "Let's just press on to the next one." Drew pulled out once more onto the empty road and continued north into Nettlewood. They approached on its eastern border, where the houses were sparse and the rolling hills were plentiful. It wasn't long before they were once more slowing down, crawling at the side of the road and intently watching the instrument. Once again it remained silent. When they were past, Drew did not stop the car, but continued on to the next point on the map. "Do you know what it is you're looking for?" Drew asked, hopefully. "Not entirely," the inspector admitted. "A change in the reading from this thing would be a start, though even not receiving a reading is still helpful." The inspector's methods were well out of Drew's realm of understanding, and he knew it. He simply drove on to find the final X, and hoped more of an explanation would present itself. The last X was in the centre of Nettlewood, and only a few minutes' drive from the inspector's hotel, and was no exception to the others. When they had passed it, the inspector made a few notes and markings on his map. Drew drove them on, and they arrived at his hotel just as the inspector replaced his instruments and map in his bag. Chapter 18. "Here we are, then." Drew brought the car to a halt and climbed out. The inspector followed suit. "Thank you so much for acting as my chauffeur, Drew. May I buy you dinner as compensation?" The sun had already set on what had been a busy day. Drew checked his watch and was surprised to discover it was 6:30. Well, Drew considered his options. At home, he faced dinner alone, followed by a solitary evening listening to the wireless. His evenings usually ended with him falling asleep in his chair, waking in the early hours and taking himself off to bed. This change to the routine was quite welcome. "I'd be delighted. Thank you, Inspector." The two men entered the hotel together and made their way directly to the restaurant section of the bar. This, like the rest of the hotel, had obviously been recently refurbished. The wallpaper had a modern pattern that reminded Drew of purple sand pouring through orange hourglasses, flooding the room with bright colours. The clean, soft carpet was covered with an intricate interweaving pattern of brightly coloured shapes. Reds and blacks and greens flowed together seamlessly. A few of the tables were occupied, not by residents of the hotel, but by locals enjoying an evening out. When Drew and the Inspector entered, the quiet murmur of conversation turned a little more frenzied, as heads turned their way and began gossiping. "I'm afraid news of your arrival, and the circumstances surrounding it, seems to have reached Nettlewood," Drew muttered to him out of earshot of those paying them so much attention. "So I see. Not to worry, Drew. Let's have a look at some menus, shall we?" They went to sit down at a nearby table when a voice from across the room called to them. "Inspector, care to join us?" They turned to the source of the voice to see a young lady sitting at a table with a rather embarrassed-looking man who Drew recognised as being Dr. Collins from Nettlewood Hospital. Drew did not recognise the lady, but she had obviously recognised the Inspector. The heads of those enjoying a quiet dinner turned to her and the doctor's table at this fresh intrusion. "Ah, wonderful. Drew, do you have any objections?" "Of course not," Drew smiled, interested to discover who she was and how the Inspector might know her. "Wonderful," the Inspector replied. They abandoned the table and made their way over, Drew feeling rather conspicuous as all eyes watched their every move. "Good evening, Casey. Wonderful to see you again," the Inspector greeted her. "And you, Inspector," Casey replied. She stood and they shook hands heartily over the table. She wore a pair of fashionable wide-flared purple corduroys and a chunky woolen jumper to keep out the cold. "This is Dr. Collins from Nettlewood Hospital. He's assisting me with the study of your body." The two men shook hands. "Good to meet you, Doctor. Casey, this is Constable Drew Gates, the constable who discovered the body. He is assisting me with my inquiries." "Good evening." Drew shook Casey's delicate hand. "Hello, Drew," she replied with a smile. "Casey is the mortician here to conduct the autopsy," the Inspector enlightened him. "Oh, I see," Drew replied, rather embarrassed to admit to himself that he hadn't been expecting a woman, nor one so young. "Dr. Ward is one of the best I have worked with," the Inspector continued. "Well, that is high praise, Inspector," she laughed infectiously, and all the men smiled. The table they had chosen had 4 chairs, so the two newcomers took the empty seats and made themselves comfortable. "Well, this looks as fine a place to eat as it does to sleep," the Inspector commented. "Have you ordered yet?" "Only 5 minutes ago," Dr. Collins replied. "They have quite an impressive menu." Casey passed one to the Inspector to peruse. Drew took one from the centre of the table. "I've gone for the cod with potatoes and peas," he informed them conversationally. "Well, I must say this all looks rather good," the Inspector replied, studying the choices with a hungry look in his eye. "Have either of you eaten here before?" He addressed the doctor and the constable. "I haven't been here for a while," Drew admitted. "Looks like Abigail has had a bit of work done on the place since I last came here." "Yes, the work was only finished a couple of weeks ago," Dr. Collins informed him. "I come here quite a lot. It's easily the best place to eat in Nettlewood." "Splendid. Then it would appear that we have chosen wisely." The Inspector didn't look up from his menu. Drew was still digesting his lunch, which was larger than he would usually have had. However, having had such a long day with the Inspector, he found the list of food available very appetising. "Dr. Collins, what would you recommend?" the Inspector asked. "Well, Casey and I are both having the fish. It's a speciality of the chef here." The Inspector immediately closed his menu. "In that case, I will join you in eating the fish," he said. Drew studied the menu for a moment more before realising the choice was too much for his tired mind. "Well, perhaps I should try it too," he conceded. "Do we order here or at the bar?" "We ordered at the table. I'm sure somebody will be out to see you soon," Casey replied. "So how goes the investigation, Inspector?" "Progressing, yes," the Inspector replied amiably. "We have just finished a tour of Nettlewood investigating some key spots of interest." "I see. And how did the tour go?" Casey asked. "Very informative," the Inspector declared to Drew's surprise. "I've discovered absolutely nothing of any use." Casey laughed while Drew and the doctor exchanged confused looks at this contradictory statement. "From my investigation so far, I can only deduce one thing. I am staying in the wrong town. Any information I'm likely to discover about Drew's discovery is more likely to be found in Firestone, so it pains me to admit that tomorrow I will need to move hotels." Despite having spent all day with the Inspector, this was the first hint he had given Drew that these were his plans. "Casey, I trust you are happy to continue on here?" "Yes, it's fine with me. No point following you when I'm so close to the hospital. I have only really just started. I'm sure the bulk of the work will get done tomorrow." "Wonderful. How long before I can come and see what you've discovered?" "I would leave it until the afternoon. Give me a couple of hours to set up." "Very well," the Inspector agreed. He decided to steer the conversation away from the body, as he was aware of the ears at the other tables pricking up at the slightest mention of a corpse. "Dr. Collins, have you been at the hospital long?" 20 years getting on now, he replied, taking a moment to work it out. Went over there when I closed my practice. Blimey, that feels like a long time now, he admitted. At this, the conversation turned from the appearance of the body to a series of anecdotes from the doctor regarding the transition of his career to the hospital. Casey and the inspector listened and seemed interested, though Drew felt this was more through politeness than through a genuine interest in the affairs of a rural GP turned coroner. As they discussed the doctor's career, which he was eloquently vocal about, Abigail approached the table with 2 plates of cod. "Hello, Inspector. I didn't see you come in," she greeted them with a smile. "Hello, Abigail. This is Constable Drew Gates from Firestone. He has kindly assisted me with my inquiries." "Hello, Drew. Lovely to meet you." She paused for a moment. "Are you Albert's boy?" "Yes, that's right," Drew replied with a smile. He liked meeting people who had known his father. "Oh, I remember you. Last time I saw you, you must have been 20 years ago. You were knee-high to a grasshopper." Drew cringed in embarrassment, and the doctor, who was the only occupant of the table drinking from a bottle of wine, laughed rather too loudly. Casey suppressed a giggle, but the inspector gave no sign of amusement, being more interested in ordering his dinner. Abigail seemed to detect that Drew was not in the correct company for her to embarrass him. "Your dad used to come in here a lot, you know. He was a really good copper, really cared about his town." "That's nice of you," Drew smiled appreciatively, glad she wasn't pursuing her memories of his childhood. Such a shame the way he went. She looked away, a melancholy look slowly creeping into her eyes. "Would it be possible to order, Abigail?" The inspector interrupted her thoughts as she sprang back to herself with a shake of the head. "Yes, of course. Sorry, Inspector. What can I get you?" She pulled a notebook from her pristine white pinny. "I believe Drew and I will both have the cod." He glanced at Drew, who simply nodded for confirmation.
"That is a popular choice this evening."
She made a note on her pad. "Any drinks?" "I'll have a pot of tea, please." "Of course." She noted this down before turning to the constable. "Drew?" "I'll just have some tea with the inspector," Drew replied. "Of course, dears. I'll bring you a nice big pot. Anything else?" She looked about the gathered guests, who shook their heads. "Nothing for now, thanks," the inspector confirmed, "though I am afraid to inform you that my plans regarding the investigation have changed somewhat, and after tonight I will no longer be requiring a room at your fine establishment." Abigail paused for a moment. "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Nothing we've done, I hope." She was obviously disappointed, but did well to remain professional. The inspector guessed correctly that her disappointment was caused by the loss of revenue during this slow season, the loss of having such a high-profile guest, and the loss of having a source of local gossip at her fingertips. "Oh, no, of course not." The inspector was quick to put the proprietor's mind at ease, loud enough for all her locals to hear. "However, I think that the main thread of my inquiries will now be concentrated in Firestone, so I will be taking a room there for the remainder of the investigation." "Well, whatever you think best," she replied, remaining friendly. "What about you, young Casey? Will you be remaining with us?" she asked, hopefully. Casey and the doctor had both begun to tuck into their dinners with gusto, and she had to finish her mouthful before replying. "Yes, Abigail, I will be here at least 2 more nights. This cod is wonderful." "Oh, I am glad to hear that. About the cod and you staying." She let out a loud, infectious laugh that all those sat around the table returned, even the inspector. "Now, I'll get these bits for you." She bustled away back to the kitchen and presently returned with a pot of tea. "Your cod won't be long," she told them, placing the tea down. "Oh, Dr. Ward, I was meaning to ask whereabouts in London you lived," she asked. Casey looked up with a smile. "Well, most of the time I'm walled up in Old Church Hospital in Romford, where I do the yard's dirty work. But when I'm not there I share a house nearby with a couple of friends," she replied. "Why?" "Well now, I know it sounds silly, but I have a niece living up there in Brixton. I wondered if you knew her." "London's a big place, Mrs. Fothergill, but there's always a chance. What's her name?" "Jocelyn Hooper," she replied, half in question, though I think nowadays she goes by Sky or Star or one of those New Age type names. She got in with that hippie lot that you see on the television," she added, as if this might help. "Well, I don't think I know any Jocelyns or any Skys, I'm afraid, but I'll keep my eyes open for one." "Well, as you say, London is a big place," Abigail agreed. "Thought I'd check on the off chance, you know." She bustled off again, and the table settled comfortably into each other's company. Casey shared a look with the inspector and hid a smile. "Do you get that a lot?" Drew asked. "What's that, Drew?" Casey asked. "I sometimes wonder if people forget that the rest of the world is unlike their sleepy villages and towns," he told her. "To some people, living in the same place as someone means you must know them." "Yes, you're right, it does happen a lot," Casey replied. "But there's no point being rude about it. I like that these smaller towns are like that. People can get lost in the crowded city, but in these small towns you always seem to get found." The conversation lulled naturally as they gratefully tucked into their meals. By the time they had finished and attempted a dessert, the evening had passed seamlessly into night. The polite conversation flowed naturally, save for the occasional silence that the inspector filled with pleasantries concerning the quality of the food they had eaten and the ambience of their surroundings. The doctor managed to quaff the whole bottle of wine, gradually becoming louder and laughing harder at his own anecdotes as the contents of the bottle emptied. It emerged he had taken a taxi over and was planning to take one back, but Drew agreed to drive him home. Before helping Dr. Collins to the car, Drew and the inspector arranged to meet at the hotel at 9 the next morning for breakfast. The inspector settled the very reasonable bill and bid good evening to Casey, who returned to the table to read the paper before turning in. He then climbed the stairs and returned to his room. Chapter 19. The first thing he did, once he was inside and the door was securely locked, was remove from his case the evidence bags containing the items he had removed from the body that morning. This was the first chance he'd had to examine them alone, and he was eager for a good look. He had kept them from the eyes of Drew, as he had realised when he had first found them that they would not be something he would be able to provide an immediate explanation for. He placed them on the dressing table. He pulled his main case out from under the bed and opened it up to reveal its cleverly concealed treasures. He tilted a compartment forward from behind the tent, and a door opened up behind it. He removed the tent momentarily to reveal a shelf holding a concise microscope set with various lenses attached. He moved it and a small wooden case of tools and set himself up on the dresser under the bright light atop the mirrors. He could hardly breathe as he opened the first bag, so afraid was he to damage the contents any further. Inside was a slab of plastic, approximately 4.5 inches long by 2.5 wide. The object was very thin, less than 1/4 of an inch. All sides but one had been covered in white plastic. The one side that was not white plastic was jet black glass, which had shattered into a web of cracks. On the back, in the top left-hand corner, there were 2 circular holes, both very small, though one was half the size of the other. In the centre was an irregular grey circle, with a pointed oval coming out of the top and a small semicircle missing from the right-hand side. At the bottom was the word iPhone, under which were the words "Designed by Apple Corp in California, constructed in China, serial number." There then followed a long series of letters and numbers. Under this were the symbols the inspector could make no sense of, but looked as though they might be more letters: an F, a C, an X with an irregular rectangle incorporated into it, another C, and an E. There was also an O with an exclamation mark in its centre. There were various holes around the edge and above the cracked glass front. The inspector studied it carefully, pressing what looked like buttons on the top and sides, though this did not have any effect on the inanimate object. As to its use he could not even guess. It was unlike anything he had ever come across, gave no clue as to what it may be used for. He took from his box of tools a flat-headed screwdriver and put the thin blade along the edge to see if he could open it up. He managed to find a small recess, and with a cautionary twist he popped the object apart. The casing came off to reveal a detail of baffling complexity, and the inspector placed the newly exposed interior under the microscope. When magnified, the true extent of the object soon became obvious, and he realised that he was not best qualified to make this examination. The inside was a complicated map of green with pinpricks of silver solder connecting a network of circuits. He replaced the 2 separated pieces into the evidence bag and carefully placed them into a large envelope. He then took to writing down everything he had discovered for his report. When he was satisfied, he prepared the next bag. The items contained therein were slightly easier to identify, as there are 4 of them in a bunch together on a ring, and at first glance they looked like a set of keys. However, they were smaller and shorter than any key he had ever seen. They were constructed of a shiny metal, presumably stainless steel. Each had one smooth straight side and one side with a sharp jagged edge. There was a 5th item that shared the ring with the keys that really puzzled him though. This was a small black plastic rectangle with rounded edges. It was elegantly designed, being very light, smooth and comfortable to hold. On it were 3 buttons, with smooth symbols embossed onto them which added to the mystery. He pushed 2 with no effect. However, on pressing the 3rd, a long thin rectangle of metal sprung out from a hidden hole. This looked like a key of some kind, though why it was hidden he was unable to discern. He pushed the metal back into its hole and pressed the button again to test the device. The key happily reappeared. Satisfied that he had discovered something about it, although what its use might be still eluded him, he replaced the keys in the evidence bag, placed them in the envelope with the first bag, and wrote the findings up for his report before moving on to the next bag. This contained a handful of change. The inspector presumed they were British coins, though there were no shillings or any other coinage he recognised. All had their denomination written on them, though strangely it was just numbers, a 50, a 2 and 2 tens. He wondered what system of currency this could have been used in. There were another 4 that proclaimed to be pound coins, though these were smaller than he recognised and made of a gold-like substance. None of the coins bore the head of Elizabeth II, but of William V, the monarch apparently being a bald, middle-aged man. Each had the same sovereign on one side and their own unique design on the other. The inspector studied each carefully under the microscope. They were all exquisitely made. The detail on the monarch's profile was finely sculptured. He carefully recorded his thoughts about them before placing them safely back in the envelope. The last bag contained a black metal cylinder and the man's wallet. The black plastic cylinder had a button on one side which, like the black and white slab, made no signs of activating the device when pressed. It was slightly thicker than his fountain pen but shorter and uniform in thickness. Like the plastic slab, he could hazard no guess as to its purpose. He returned to the wallet he had studied earlier and took more time to investigate its contents. There were 3 more plastic cards, the same size as the one proclaiming to be the man's driving licence. One had the word Nat West printed on the side and the man's name embossed across it. Another was blue on one side with Tesco Club Card written in white on one side, and on the other was a series of black lines under which was a long series of numbers. The wallet also contained some banknotes, 2 £5 and a 10. These were made of plastic and were smaller than the notes he was used to. They seemed more like toy money. All the notes had intricate details surrounding portraits of William V. Although mystified by all the objects, he was certain that they were genuine. Creating such things had obviously taken a lot of mechanical ingenuity, and so he ruled out the hypothesis that they were planted on the body to distract any investigation into the man's appearance. He placed the last bag into the envelope along with his handwritten report, and it all went back into his case. The objects helped cement his original assumption regarding the man. He had been snatched from his own time and had appeared in the trees surrounding Firestone. The inspector reasserted the task ahead of him. He needed to discover how he had appeared there, and if possible, why. More importantly, he had to stop it from happening again. He also had to consider the possibility that it might have happened before, and that the trip of any others may not have ended up in such a grisly matter. Some may have survived. He replaced the microscope and tools carefully away in the case and replaced the tent. He then opened a small drawer in the case and removed a red light bulb and a length of string. Another compartment revealed 2 bottles of developing fluid and a sheaf of lustre paper. These he took into the bathroom and carefully placed on the bath mat. He removed the light bulb and light shade currently dangling from the ceiling on their electrical wire and replaced them with his own red bulb. He removed the mirror over the sink, and from the wall opposite it he removed a small picture of mannequin Piz. He hung from the exposed nails his length of string so it was suspended like a washing line. He returned to the bedroom and retrieved the used film from his coat pocket and turned his bedroom light off. He then entered his makeshift darkroom. With only the red light to illuminate it, the bathroom was dimmer, the shadows darker and more profuse. He emptied the development chemicals into the bath, ran a little water into the sink, and began to develop the films. He started with the roll from Drew's camera, containing the images he had taken the night before. As he hung the carefully treated sheets of paper onto the line, images began to slowly appear on them. When all were exposed, he began studying them carefully. Even in the dull red glow afforded him by the red bulb, it was obvious that there was something very wrong with the woods that surrounded Firestone. Tuesday the 4th of November 1969. Chapter 20. When the inspector eventually turned in for the night, it was in the early hours of Tuesday morning. His report on the day's activity had been written, all the photographs had been processed, and copies had been made where he saw appropriate. Before bed he swallowed 2 small pills, which allowed his body to rest more fitfully and to sleep more deeply. He awoke at 8, fully rested, and began preparing for the day. He hadn't been resident in the hotel long enough to empty clothes from his case, so he dressed in items from his trunk that were still as well pressed as the day they were packed. When he was satisfied with his appearance, double-breasted dark blue suit, waistcoat, white shirt, red tie and well-polished shoes, he made his way down to the restaurant area of the hotel. He found Casey had already arrived and was enjoying a round of toast. Judging by the depletion of jam from the jar, the consistency the butter had reached since being exposed to room temperature, and the numerous crumbs surrounding her plate, he took this to be her 3rd round and that she had been there about 30 minutes. She sat comfortably at the same table they had dined at the evening before, partially eating slice in her left hand, a mouthful of grilled bread being slowly chewed in her mouth. A copy of the Telegraph was spread out in front of her, and as the inspector approached she swallowed and looked up. "Morning, Inspector. I'm afraid I've just drained the last cup out of this pot." She nodded to the cold, empty pot on the table. "How did you sleep?" "Very well, thank you, Casey. And yourself?" "Yes. Well, it's very quiet here, isn't it?" "Yes, very peaceful." "Help yourself to toast. I'm full." The inspector nodded and began buttering one of the slices that remained on the rack. Casey reached the sports pages at the back of the paper, and as these offered her nothing of interest, she closed it. "I've trawled through every inch of the Telegraph and can find no mention of your body. This little corner of Britain seems to be well concealed in its quiet, peaceful quaintness." She offered the paper to him, and he accepted it. "And that is how I would like it to remain, or at least I do not wish for it to become known for such dark notoriety as has caused our presence here." He added marmalade to the rapidly cooling bread. "These things may seem as humdrum everyday events to us." He studied the front page of the paper and immediately found a report of a murder in the East End of London. But here the loss of life still has meaning, and can still turn a town upside down. "Do you expect anyone from the town?" Casey asked. Her questions were not asked with the concern that came from a resident, but with the business-like nonchalance of someone who dealt with death every day. The inspector paused thoughtfully before answering, considering the evidence that he had examined the night before. "I think I require more time before I draw any conclusion as to the identity of those responsible for putting our unfortunate friend where Drew happened upon him." "Is that your way of saying you don't know?" Casey asked with a smile. "I'm saying it's too early to tell, but it is unlikely that anyone here was directly responsible." Casey sipped her tea. These matters were really nothing to do with her line of the inquiry. She merely asked the inspector to make conversation. She recognised his tentativeness at revealing too much regarding the case, and so did not pursue the matter further. She checked her watch. "It's coming up to 9. Drew and Dr. Collins should be here soon," she observed. "Yes, I wonder in what state the thirsty doctor will be in this morning," the inspector asked. "He was a little worse for wear by the end of the night, wasn't he?" Casey laughed. "Indeed." The inspector shared a smile with her. "Ah, morning, Inspector." Abigail approached her table with a tray and placed the empty teapot on it. "What are you two smiling about, then?" "Good morning, Abigail," the inspector returned her greeting. "We were just wondering how the doctor's head will be feeling this morning," Casey replied for them. "Oh, yes, Alan knows how to put it away, doesn't he? Strange to see him drinking so much on a work night, though, you know," she added quickly in his defence. "It must have been the excitement of sharing a table with our two honoured guests." "Yes, I'm sure," the inspector replied reassuringly. Casey blushed a little. "Can I get you anything, or are you all right with the toast?" Abigail set herself back to the task in hand. The inspector cleared his throat. "May I have 2 rashers of bacon, 2 sausages, 2 eggs, fried and with runny yolks, another round of toast, and a fresh pot of tea, please?" Abigail hurried to scribble everything down. "Of course, love. Are you finished, Casey?" "Yes, thank you, Abigail." "Right you are, then." Abigail added Casey's empty plate and the last of the cold toast that sat on the rack to the tray. "How did you sleep?" Abigail asked the inspector. "Wonderfully, thank you," he replied. "Still planning on checking out this morning?" she asked. "Indeed I am. I hope Drew will be joining me for breakfast in a few moments, so would it be possible to have that order twice?" Abigail paused in her loading of the tray to scribble this on her pad with a satisfied smile at the amount of money the inspector was spending in her hotel. "Of course, Inspector, it won't be long. I'll just fetch you tea." She bustled away into the kitchen with her tray and began to loudly bark instructions at her husband. "Poor man," Casey sighed at the continued harassment of Harold. "All she's done this morning is order her husband around." "Well, apparently they've been together years, and they run a fine hotel. They must be doing something right," the inspector pointed out, playing devil's advocate more than defending Abigail's treatment of her husband. "Yes," Casey conceded before adding, "but at what cost? Poor man is heading for a heart attack at this rate." They ceased their discussion as Abigail reappeared with a fresh tray of tea things and placed it down on the table before beginning to unload its contents with much clinking and scraping as cups were placed on saucers. "I bought cups for Drew and Alan when they arrived," she informed them without pausing or looking up. "Your attention to detail is only matched by your delightful hospitality," the inspector informed her with a smile. She blushed slightly as she finished unloading, then vanished off towards the kitchen again. The inspector stirred the pot. "Drew seems like a fine fellow," Casey mentioned airily. "Yes, he is indeed. A good policeman as well," the inspector agreed. "Another cup?" he offered to Casey. "No thanks, I've already had 3 this morning. Actually, will you excuse me?" Casey made her way to the toilet, and the inspector poured himself a cup, then turned his attention to the slowly brightening morning out of the window next to which their table was situated. The view was not as broad as that from the window in his bedroom. He faced out onto the road across the well-kept lawn. He wondered if he would see either of their expected guests approaching, but the car park entrance was unseen from this view. He kept an ear open for the door, and presently heard it open, and the familiar plod of Drew's feet approached the table. "Good morning, Inspector. Enjoying the view?" he asked jovially. The inspector turned with a delighted smile. Today Drew was dressed in full uniform, and though much more formal than his attire of the previous day, he looked relaxed and it fitted him naturally. "Good morning, Constable. Yes, just enjoying a fresh cup of tea as the day tries to struggle into life. How are you today?" "Yes, I'm fine, thank you. Have Casey and the doctor already left?" "No, we're still awaiting Dr. Collins' arrival." He checked his watch. 2 minutes past 9. "I admire your punctuality. Would you care for a cup of tea? I took the liberty of ordering you breakfast." "Well, that's very kind of you, Inspector." Drew sat in the same seat he had been in last night, as had the Inspector and Casey, as if these were now forever their allotted places in the dining hall of the Swan and Dove.